Hello there and welcome back to another video. In today's video, I'm going to be putting a few different hardware configurations through their paces with a super popular brand new AAA title, Forza Horizon 6. Now, I know I'm a little late to the hype party around this game, considering that it came out almost 3 weeks ago, but if I'm being honest, I wanted to enjoy this game a little bit myself before sitting down and having to go through the painful process of benchmarking it. I personally find benchmarking pretty miserable and didn't want my first time with this game, which I've been really excited about and have had a ton of fun playing, to be tainted by my least favorite task related to making tech YouTube videos. But in any case, I'm making the video now, and I hope it's still relevant to a bunch of people who have recently picked up this game or who are thinking about buying it in the near future. So let's go over the more budget-oriented hardware that I'll be testing today then, shall we? The first configuration I'll be going over today is the configuration featured in my somewhat recent janky Dell Optiplex gaming PC video. This system has an Intel Core i7-2600, yep, that's a second generation chip, paired with 16GB of DDR3 memory and a GTX 980 4GB graphics card. The system is comprised of old hardware, can be replicated really quite easily and cheaply, and is going to represent the lowest tier hardware configuration I'll be testing today, to see if this game will even run on decade-old hardware, if that's what you've got, or if that's what you can afford. The next setup I'll be checking out is a setup that uses a 6GB RTX 3050 graphics card in an old Office PC. I'm doing this because this card, plus an old small form factor Office PC that you can pick up super cheap, is a great way to get an inexpensive gaming PC, and I want to see how one of these configurations will perform in this title. Now, I don't have an actual small form factor Office PC lying around right now, but I do have a bigger PC that's got a similar chip to what you could get in a cheap Office PC, that being an i3-6100. So I'll be testing this card in that. And finally, the highest tier hardware configuration I'll look at today is another configuration that's been featured before on the channel, and this time it's the RTX 3070 and Core i7-8700 configuration that I used in my $500 gaming PC video that I put out several months ago. And fun fact, even though prices have done things since that video came out, this build configuration is actually still something you can pull off on eBay relatively easily. So that's nice. And now, while I get the first of the 3 configurations set up for benchmarking, let me talk about what my methodology is going to be here, because I'm going to try and represent 2 different aspects of the performance simultaneously. For each system, I will be benchmarking the game at 2 different presets. The high preset in the built-in benchmark, for the sake of being able to easily compare all 3 systems apples to apples, as well as whatever preset I feel gives the best balance between performance and visual quality for that given hardware configuration. I'm doing this because I know there are people out there who are going to really want to see what the amount of improvement between something like a GTX 980 and an RTX 3050 will be in terms of hard percentages and numbers that can be put up against each other. Yet, for a good experience in this game, you need a higher frame rate than you might get out of the 980 at these standardized benchmarking settings. And telling you that one of the systems gets 20 FPS at the high preset doesn't necessarily help you understand if it'll give a usable performance when you turn the settings down to medium or low. And on the other end of that spectrum, if the 3070 destroys the high preset, maybe the preset that gives the best experience on that card will actually be ultra, or even extreme. And it might be worth turning up to those settings, because one of the best things about this game, in my opinion, is the sheer visual quality of this beautiful map set in Japan. Being able to drive around and take in the views is great, as long as you have a solid enough frame rate. So, as long as you can get 60 plus FPS, I really recommend turning the visual quality up as much as you can afford. And so I'll be trying to find settings that really hit right around that 60 FPS mark while also having the highest visual quality from that system. Now, a couple of final notes before actually hitting the benchmarks. All of these benchmarks were run at native 1080p, and in all cases, fresh Windows installs were used, with both Windows and Forza installed on NVMe SSDs. Though there was one exception to the NVMe SSD rule, and that was the 2nd gen Intel system, which was using a SATA SSD because that predates NVMe. So, with that said, let's pop into a fresh Windows 11 install on the system with an i7-2600, 16GB of DDR3 RAM, and a GTX 980, fire up Forza Horizon 6 at native 1080p, and start testing. Starting with the standardized high preset benchmark, this system managed an average frame rate of 26.3 FPS with a 1% low of 21.3 and a 0.1% low of 3.2. Honestly, this performance was surprisingly solid, all things considered, especially when we notice that we're clearly hitting some limits with the 4GB of DDR5 VRAM on this card. Additionally, it seems that this CPU and GPU are really quite well matched in this game, which is also great to see, as I was minorly concerned with CPU performance due to the fact that this game seems to be really quite CPU heavy compared to some other titles. Now moving into the actual game and testing out a preset that I think gives a good balance of performance and visual quality, I ended up settling on the low preset. At this preset, the system manages an average frame rate just below the ideal 60 FPS mark, with an average frame rate of 56.2 FPS and 1% and 0.1% lows of 36.4 and 19.1 FPS respectively. Of course, the game doesn't look great at this preset, but this sadly seems to be necessary on this card to get a decent performance. And thankfully, this performance, as indicated by the percentile lows, was really quite smooth, and again, just decent. I was also really quite impressed at this game's ability to be seemingly unbothered by the 4GB of VRAM, even though it was almost constantly using all of it. And I think I can say that Forza Horizon 6 is definitely playable on a GTX 980, though do keep in mind the 980 is not officially supported and could very possibly stop working in this game in future updates. Alright, now let's move on to the second configuration, the RTX 3050 6GB with an i3-6100 and 16GB of DDR4 RAM. For those unfamiliar with the RTX 3050 6GB, this card is an RTX 3000 series card that's available in a dual slot, low profile form factor, and that only requires the power that a standard PCIe slot can provide to run. This means that it's an exceptional card for repurposing older, small form factor office PCs that have limited power available, as well as limited PCIe expansion space. The system I'll be running it in today is not the kind of system that this card is best suited for, as this computer is a full tower system with an ATX power supply that has PCI Express connectors on it, but I'm using this system because it's all I've got on hand currently, and it has a CPU that lines up well with what you could get in a more suitable system. So let's fire this system up and see how it does in the benchmark mode at the high preset. And it doesn't do that hot. Wow. In the high preset, we only got an average frame rate of 26.2 FPS with a 1% and 0.1% low of 9.8 and 5.4 FPS respectively, which is a lot worse than the 980 got. What gives? Well, it wasn't that hard to figure out, based on the MSI Afterburner overlay and the results screen from the benchmark mode, that the issue was the CPU. I have to be fully honest here, I really thought that the i3-6100 was a 4-core, 4-thread chip going into this, making it at least semi-comparable to something like a 4th gen, or even not that far off of, a 6th gen i5. But nope, it's a dual-core hyper-threaded chip, so of course it performed awfully in this. Whoops. So this ended up being a very poor representation of the 3050 and what it could do in a decent SFF Office PC, because my stand-in for an SFF Office PC was a really crappy computer. So I think I need to come up with something better than this system that I was originally using for it, just so that we can actually get a good representation of what you could get from this card. Thankfully, the Dell Precision 3630 that wasn't supposed to come out until the next set of benchmarks with the 3070 has an Intel Core i7-8700 in it, which is a chip that you can absolutely get in an SFF Office PC, though usually not for super cheap. But you could get something like an i5-8500 for less than $100 pretty easily, and that chip should probably perform pretty close to what the 8700 will do with this card. Anyway, to give a better overall picture of the 3050's capabilities and what it could do in a more reasonably picked Office PC, let's put it through its paces in the Dell Precision with its i7-8700 and 32GB of DDR4 RAM. In this system, in the benchmark mode at the high preset, we see a much more respectable performance, with an average frame rate of 46.3 FPS paired with percentile lows of 38.6 as the 1% low and 11.4 as the 0.1% low. That's a lot more in line with what I was expecting, and I'm very glad to see this. Even though this performance isn't quite the ideal 60 FPS, I think this game would honestly be playable at the high preset with this card. Plus, it's worth noting that at least at 1080p, 6GB of VRAM seems to be a non-issue, considering that I didn't see usage above 5GB during this benchmark. Alright, that's a lot better. But what preset works best for a good balance of frame rate and visual quality in this game with this card? While high does work, when driving really fast, 45 FPS feels a little bit jagged, so let's see if medium is a good compromise. And medium was In fact, a great compromise, with an average frame rate of 67.1 FPS being achieved with this card. And this average was plenty smooth as well, with a 1% low of 46 FPS and a 0.1% low of 37.3. Now, medium doesn't look entirely exceptional in this game, but it's a heck of a lot better than low. Plus, you could probably do some tweaking to get your average performance right around 55 to 60 FPS, while increasing the fidelity of the most important features, like reflections and texture quality. So hey, a standard SFF office PC with a low-profile 3056 gig seems like it's on the table for anyone wanting to play Forza Horizon 6. Just make sure not to completely skimp on the CPU, or you may find yourself quite limited by it. And with that, we're on to testing the final computer configuration of the day, the $500 Core i7 32GB of DDR4 and RTX 3070 system, which you can mostly still get for $500. You may have to accept 16 gigs of DDR4, an 8% slower RTX 3060 Ti instead of the 3070, and some patience waiting for deals, but I think you can probably still pull it off without having to wait too long. Anyway, in benchmark mode at the high preset, this system put out an impressive frame rate of 70.6 FPS with a 1% low of 45.5 and a 0.1% low of 3.1, which was a mishap on my part with the benchmarking, so don't worry too much about that 0.1% low figure. And unsurprisingly, to me at least, the RTX 3070, paired with a decent enough CPU, can still play this game pretty well at 1080p native and high settings. This game might prove to be a bit more of a challenge if one were to step up to 1440p, but it does seem that there's still headroom in terms of VRAM, and I expect that you could probably make it happen. But sticking to the 1080p realm, because that's where this video is supposed to live, let's try playing this game at the Ultra preset, as I think this might be the perfect setting for this card, garnering, hopefully, around 60 frames per second with exceptional visual quality. And yeah, in-game, at Ultra settings, I saw an average frame rate of 69.1 FPS with a 1% low of 41 and a 0.1% low of 18.1, indicating an exceptional performance and one that looked amazing as well. Unsurprisingly, this hardware configuration offers the best experience in this game, but it's an RTX 3070, so it honestly should. And now, let's move on to the conclusion about what you might want to look for in terms of hardware for running Forza Horizon 6, or what you can expect from Forza Horizon 6 on the hardware you've already got. If you're considering running the game on some much older hardware, stuff like the GTX 900 series cards, I think you'll have a grand old time, albeit not with great visual quality. The higher-end 900 series cards cannot run the game at decent frame rates at anything much more than low settings. This will give you a very playable and usable experience, but considering the beauty of this game and how much being able to experience that really does improve it, you will be leaving part of the experience on the table. Further, if you are looking at a lower end 900 series card, something like a 950 or a 960, you might be out of luck, as I don't believe that those cards will be able to get a very good frame rate even at the lowest settings. If you were to step up to a low-end but more modern card though, something like the 3056 gig that you could use to beef up an old 7th or 8th gen Office PC, you'll likely be able to move the visual quality up to medium and possibly even squeeze out a mix of medium and high settings. This will give you, in my opinion, a very solid performance, where you're not losing as much of the visuals as you will if you run the game on something older. And finally, if you're planning to run Forza Horizon 6 on a couple of generations old mid-range to high-end card, you're going to get a great experience all around. It seems that this game can easily be run at 60 plus FPS, at ultra settings, at native 1080p, without an issue if you're using something like an RTX 3070. Plus, it manages to leave enough VRAM headroom to maybe even squeeze out some native 1440p. This will give you the fullest experience of the game, and I think is a pretty great sweet spot for experiencing this game as well, as it's not that expensive, at least when you compare it to current gen brand new hardware prices. And my final note on all this is that personally, I've been playing this game on my main PC that has a Core Ultra 7 265K, 64 gigs of DDR5, and an RX 6950 XT in it, all on a 1440p OLED display with the settings completely cranked. And that experience has been exceptional. However, I feel that when stepping down to what the 3070 system gave me, I really didn't lose that much. After that though, the 3050 and 980 systems definitely felt that they were leaving some of the experience on the table, which is a bit of a bummer, at least to me. Now what that means to you is entirely up to you. If you really don't care about visuals, then by all means, pick up a $50 GTX 980. But if you want to experience the game to its fullest, I do recommend finding a way to run it on some nicer hardware. But remember, you don't have to necessarily go too nice, as I personally believe that diminishing returns is pretty strong here. Well, that's all that I have for you in this video. I hope that you were able to at least enjoy it and maybe even learn a thing or two. In any case, I hope to see you next time. Goodbye.